This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by General Frank McKenzie Jr., Executive Director of the University of South Florida's Global and National Security Institute and the Florida Center for Cybersecurity. General McKenzie is the former commander of U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, where he played a key role in several critical U.S. military operations, including the strikes on Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in 2020. General McKenzie joins us today to discuss the viability of military options against Iran's nuclear program. Stay with us. General McKenzie, you were the CENTCOM commander and know so much about the Middle East, and this is on the minds of everyone here in Washington and definitely in the region as we cope with a new Middle East, an Iran that has been substantially degraded. Israel's proxy enemies are apparently on the run, and reportedly, it's an easier pathway to strike the Iranian nuclear facilities as a result of the exchanges between Israel and Iran. So we want to get to all these questions with you today. Thank you for joining us.
Michael, great to be with you here today. Always look forward to these conversations. Well,
thank you so much. I think our listeners are really going to learn a lot here. First of all, let me just ask you about the new Middle East. You've been so deep into the details for so many years in your career. I wonder if I could just ask you at the outset about how you think things are going and where Israel finds itself.
Absolutely. And let me just turn that question around a little bit and say it's Iran that has really had the most profound change in fortunes over the last year or so in the Middle East. Iran is now the weakest it's been in my memory. And what do I mean by that? I mean that their principal external partner, proxy, ally, strategic reserve, Lebanese Hezbollah, no longer exists as an organization that can threaten Israel. I always felt as the CENTCOM commander that the most threatening weapon that could be employed against Israel would be precise missiles fired from Lebanon by Lebanese Hezbollah. And Israel has really done away with that threat, at least in the short term. They've decapitated Hezbollah, command and control at the military and political echelon. And from what I know, and what I know is what I read in public media, they've done a very good job of going after that huge inventory of precise missiles that could be targeted against Israeli population centers. Because the reason that's dangerous is the range is so short. And we'll talk about that when we talk about Iran's relative ineffectiveness attacking Israel. But Hezbollah had the advantage of very close range and a dual axis attack. You can attack from the north while Iran threatens from the east. Well, that threat is gone. And that's a profound loss for Iran in many, many ways and undermines some of the very basic fundamental tenets of their security policy. The next thing that happened, of course, is the collapse of Bashar Assad in Syria. And he went down because his regime has always been supported. His tottering regime has been tottering for many years, has been supported by Russia, by Lebanese Hezbollah, and by Iran. For reasons that are clear to us all three of those entities are no longer in a position to continue to provide that. We're no longer in a condition to provide that support. So his regime collapsed like a house of cards. So that has forced, there's a deep void now in what used to be Syria. Unclear how that's going to turn out, but it's not going to be the area of safe passage and relative harmony that it was for Iran before. I don't want to rule Iran out of there, but it's just a very different thing. So that's a significant problem. Now, the other thing is, of course, what's happened with Hamas. Hamas has not been destroyed by Israel, but Hamas has been defeated by Israel. Unfortunately, for an organization like Hamas, defeat is not probably going to be good enough to prevent them from remaining in some form of a viable form in Gaza, and we'll see how that develops over the truce here in the next few days. But the last point I would make is the exchange of attacks on Israel proper by Iran and Israel's response against Iran really sort of put a coda on it and demonstrate the widening gap in capabilities that exist between Iran and Israel, all of these things taken together put Iran in the weakest position really they've been in many years.
That's fascinating. Can I ask you, though, and I know the Israelis were very adept. We've talked about the pager operation and other covert actions. But I think I was a bit surprised at how quickly they were able to degrade Hezbollah. Did that happen easier than you maybe anticipated? I mean, what was the secret here?
It happened a lot easier than I anticipated. I didn't see that one coming. And I am very knowledgeable of Israeli capabilities. But I think it happened for a couple of reasons. The pager operation, the beeper operation, all those processes had been in place for years. And I think the common perception now is that Lebanese Hezbollah had begun to suspect that. And so it's use it or lose it. The Israelis chose to use it. And that took out the entire middle echelon of Hezbollah's command and control. Mm-hmm. And of course, unfortunately, there were civilian lives lost there, so collateral damage that occurred there. But the effect really was to take out that middle tier. And then Hassan Nasrallah himself, I always believed from the beginning on October the 7th, Hassan Nasrallah would not go to war with Israel over Hamas. For a variety of reasons, they wouldn't go to war. Lebanese Hezbollah would not go into a major war with Israel unless they saw the opportunity for strategic victory. And those conditions did not obtain at any point during this conflict. They couldn't see a path to the destruction of Israel. But what happened, perhaps unwittingly, Nasrallah allowed Lebanese Hezbollah to carry out a low-level cross-border program of strikes that had the effect of evacuating, as you know, tens of thousands of Israeli citizens south, which created a policy dynamic in Israel that they had to take action against Lebanese Hezbollah. I believe Nasrallah miscalculated. He did not think that Israel would come that hard against him because he did not think he had crossed a red line. And it happens in combat and in war. Contending parties often underestimate or misestimate the red lines of their opponent. In this case, I think Hassan Nasrallah underestimated the degree to which Israel needed to restore security up north and the degree of violence which they were willing to go after or willing to apply against Lebanese Hezbollah in order to do that. And look, I'm not sympathetic to Lebanese Hezbollah at all. They've done a lot of bad things in the existence of that organization, including people like the United States Marines. And of course, I'm a Marine, and I too have a long memory for that. So I have no sympathy for them, but I do not believe in this case at this time they wanted a major war, but they backed into it. And the ferocity and precision of the Israeli strike was simply overwhelming.
Gotcha. And were you surprised that the Israelis actually went after Nasrallah in an assassination, or was that kind of common knowledge at CENTCOM that this would eventually happen?
Well, I think they would have got him if they could have earlier. I don't think they could have. My assumption was it was too hard a target. And as you know, the Israelis went after him pretty hard here, and they did get him. My assumption was I didn't think there was any protection around Nasrallah, simply that it was a very difficult technical problem to do the targeting, and they got a situation where they thought they could have success, and apparently they did.
Let me ask you, you played a gigantic role, of course, when President Trump ordered a strike on Qasem Soleimani, the head of the IRGC, in 2020. How much or how important was he to the IRGC, and was his demise a factor in how all of these proxies were able to behave in 2024? And did that play a role in the collapse of some of these proxies?
I believe Qasem Soleimani was a unique individual. He existed outside the actual military chain of command. Iran has a joint chiefs. They have the Artash, the military command and control structure. He was, of course, the Quds Force commander, a sub-element of the Republican Guards, which really isn't even, which isn't even the leader of the Republican Guards. But he had a familiar relationship with the Supreme Leader. He could go to the Supreme Leader. He could operate outside all of the normal channels in order to get what he wanted. And the fact of the matter is, he was intensely charismatic. He was a good backslapper. He could fly into Iraq, knock heads, and get everybody on the same azimuth. His successor, Ismail Ghani, is unable to do that. In fact, doesn't speak particularly good Arabic. He's an Easterner, not a Westerner, and his specialty is Afghanistan more than the Arab world. However, so Soleimani was about. People say, he was the equivalent of Erwin Rommel for them, and I would not say that. I would say he was the equivalent of Reinhard Heydrich. If I were going to compare him to somebody, I wouldn't. If I were picking Nazis to compare him to, that's the Nazi I'd pick. Not I'd pick Reinhard Heydrich. But he was very effective, and so I think I think President Trump made absolutely the right decision to strike him when he did on the evening of 2-3 January 2020. He was going into Baghdad to coordinate further attacks on our embassy. I don't mean he was going to run up against the embassy wall with a satchel charge himself, but he was certainly going to coordinate that and coordinate other attacks in the region. The intelligence was really solid. I was very comfortable with the intelligence. It was my recommendation to the president. He made the decision and we struck. The effect has been profound. It has been absolutely profound. Foreign Minister Zarif made the mistake 3 or 4 years ago now, maybe 4 years ago, made the mistake of recording an oral history in Iran. And of course, it leaked. And it's actually reported on the front page of the New York Times, where he said the loss of Qasem Soleimani was like losing a major city in Iran, very hard to recover from. It really set them back. And to go to one of your very good questions it's much harder for them to bring their proxies together after Soleimani's gone. Much harder to get everybody all the little ships sailing in the same direction. They miss him and they miss him to this day. But I'd go a step further, Michael. The point I'd make is 3 things happened during Trump 1.0 that had an effect on everything we've discussed to this point. The first one was the strike on Soleimani, because it established that we were not afraid to use violence against Iran, and it roughly reset a certain level of deterrence there. And it caused the Iranians to recalculate. They never doubt our capability. They always doubt our will. Now they had to recalculate. That was number one. Number two, and I think very important, were the Abraham Accords, which really began to open Israel into the region diplomatically and economically, and ultimately possibly even culturally. Very important. I don't want to overstate the importance of it, but very important. And the third thing, it may seem like a small thing, but it's actually very important, was President Trump's decision to bring Israel into the Central Command area of responsibility. And he signed the Unified Command Plan 12 days before he left office in 21. And that was a profound, very helpful, because now Central Command can coordinate directly with Israel. And some of the successes you've seen in Israel's ability to defend itself over the successive waves of Iranian attacks has been because of the ability to do direct coordination, which we could sort of do before, but it was just harder. Now it's easier to directly coordinate. And equally importantly, it's now possible to bring the chiefs of defense of all the Arab nations and Israel together, because the CENTCOM commander has that convening authority. That's often overlooked, but I will tell you, it's very important and has led directly to some of the successes associated with the defense of Israel in these recent attacks.
That's fascinating, especially about the role of Soleimani and how that carries on moving forward. All right, let's move to the 2 volleys between Israel and Iran militarily. First of all, I wonder if you subscribe to the view that the Iranian ballistic missile program did not crack up to be all that we thought. And second, how do you think the Iranians performed in their attacks on Israel? And was it less than you assumed it would be, or was it were they less capable than we had projected?
Michael, it's always been my view, and this is a little different from others, the crown jewels of Iranian deterrence, the core of Iranian deterrence has never been the nuclear program. And we can talk about the nuclear program separately here in just a moment. It rather has been the combination of ballistic missiles, drones, and land attack cruise missiles, which they've spent vast amounts of money on over the last 20 years. They've dramatically increased the size, scope of their arsenal. And we saw their missiles are actually very accurate. When they struck at al-Assad as a response to the Soleimani attack, they hit the targets they wanted to hit. We survived deaths merely because we moved away from those targets before they struck the targets. So the missiles are very accurate. But here's the thing. Israel is a long way from Iran. Israel probably has had and probably has today roughly 1,000 missiles that can probably reach Israel. But they have a problem. It's a throughput problem. They only have, who knows, I don't know the numbers anymore, and I couldn't give them to you if I did. Let's say about 200 tractor erector launchers. Those missiles have to be brought out of storage, taken to launch sites, prepped, and then fired. So that means in any salvo against Israel, you can only launch about a couple hundred ballistic missiles. And then you've got to go back, reload, and refire. So you can't overwhelm Israeli defenses with 800 missiles. If you'll recall, that's what I feared about Lebanese Hezbollah because of the proximity to Israel and their ability to launch much shorter range missiles at a high volume. So Iran is limited in the number of heavyweight ballistic missiles, theater range ballistic missiles that it can put against Tel Aviv. In the first attack, and let me, before you get into that, we should all understand Iran attacked Israel in April, not because of Gaza or Hamas, but rather because Iran has been significantly outfought in the shadow war against Israel and its proxies around the region, culminating in the attack on IRGC planners in Damascus. So this was a response to that, not coming in to support Gaza, and we should be clear in understanding that. Okay, so in April, they launched a large volley of missiles, and the Iranian theory is you go with drones and cruise missiles first to knock out the radars for the ballistic missile defense assets. And Israeli ballistic missile defense assets are Patriot, of course. Now we have THAAD in there. We didn't have it in there then. Then they've got Arrow, they've got David Sling, Iron Dome, Iron Beam, a variety of systems, all that work at different altitudes against different kinds of missiles. But the theory is, and it's not a bad theory if you're attacking somebody closer to you like Saudi Arabia or UAE, the theory is you go in with a cloud of drones and cruise missiles first, take out the radars, and then the ballistic missile systems can't operate against your heavyweight ICBMs, or not ICBMs, but medium range, short range ballistic missiles. They're going to come in with the heavy warheads. So what happened was, first of all, we had knowledge of the attack beforehand because our intelligence gathering is very good. We shared that information with the Israelis, and the Israelis also are very good. We were able to prevent the drones and cruise missiles from having any effect against the radars. Why? Because they got to go a long way to get to Israel. Our radar coverage is very good. We have partners in the region that helped us. So strategic depth is a factor. So you couldn't take out the radars. So when Iran launched their wave of ballistic missiles, you're able to operate against it. And the Israeli success rate was very high. And one thing I would just point out, a lot of images of warheads falling to the ground in Israel. And some of these warheads got through, not many, but the systems are designed, the algorithm is designed, if we don't think the warhead's going to hit a defended area, you let it fall because it's not going to hurt anything. So missiles will get through, but those are often missiles that have been selected by the defender to fall to earth so we don't expend fire.
Gotcha.
So first attack, I would say, remarkably unsuccessful, as you know. So what was interesting, and I think very important, was the Israeli response. I think wrote an article about this, maybe in the Wall Street Journal somewhere, I forget, talking about it. I was worried that the Israelis would go back with a massive attack against Iran, and that would have the effect of pushing the Biden administration away, and it would have the far more pernicious effect, perhaps, of pushing the Arab neighbors away. But what the Israelis did instead was actually brilliant. They operated in the Tehran corridor, which we know is the nuclear corridor. They used a combination of long-range missiles, perhaps manned aircraft, and perhaps drones launched from within Iran, all of which had the cumulative effect of befuddling the Iranians and demonstrating, hey, we can operate over your skies with impunity, and widen the technological gap while preserving. You didn't go there and cause a big mass casualty event. I thought it was a very often the Israeli responses tend to be very heavy-handed. This one was not. It was really beautifully scoped in order to do that. Okay, so now we go fast forward to the second Iranian attack. This time they didn't use drones. They didn't use crew. They tried to launch more ballistic missiles, and again, about the same results. More, I think the volley count was probably higher, but you're not going to overwhelm Israeli defenses at those numbers. A couple got through. We know this, not many, and so. This time, the Israeli response was far larger, but also carefully constrained. They went back to Iran. They took out really Iran's air defense network, the S-300s, Russian systems, OK plus systems, 4 of them. I think when I read the New York Times tells me they're not working now. It's hard to get replacement parts for S-300s from Russia because they're kind of using them in other places right now. So Iran is strategically bereft of its air defense coverage. So that brings us up to today. Iran gambled twice against Israel. They lost both times. And your question was, Did the Iranian missile system underperform? No, I think it performed about what we thought it would do, given the constraints under which they had to operate. Now, look, if they had attacked Saudi Arabia or UAE, the results might have been different. There, they could have used missiles that didn't require being hauled out on a tail, long-range missiles. They could have used much shorter-range missiles. There, you could possibly have gained overmatch against the defenses of your adjacent neighbors. And that's something we should remember. That threat is still very real. And the Iranian ballistic missiles performed about like I thought they would, given how well I thought Israeli defenses would operate. And again, three components of that. Israelis are good, we helped, and the neighbors helped.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with General Frank McKenzie.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
All right, let's get to the big question. To me, one of the largest intelligence questions today is, as a result of these two exchanges between Israel and Iran, and you confirmed what I was going to ask you, that some of the S-300s and their air defense and certainly some radars have been knocked out. Most people have noted, and it's been put on the table, that Iran is newly vulnerable to an Israeli strike. They have a safer path across Syria where they're going to take that route, and they've knocked out air defenses around Tehran. So now it's on the table like never before. Let me see if I can tier a couple of questions for you. Let's start with, if Israel acted alone without the United States and without any new weapon systems that we might transfer to them, and in acknowledging that there are nuclear sites all over the country, can you sort of grade for us how successful they might be if they were to go on an all-out Israeli raid against their nuclear program?
Sure, I think right now, as we sort of talked about, they're weaker. They're the weakest they've been in a long time. The option is certainly there that Israel could strike against them if they chose to do it. But the Iranian nuclear program is a big program. It's a lot of fissile material that's buried deep underground. It's hard to get to. You can't really destroy it. Hard to destroy it. You can destroy access to it, but you can dig back in later. You can go after the workers. You can certainly do that. You can go after the people who work in the factories. You can go after the infrastructure. A number of targets. You can set them back. Hard to do away with the program completely, and hard for the Israelis to get to the deep underground targets. The United States has certain capabilities that they don't have that would allow them to do that, that will allow us to do that. The Israelis just don't have those capabilities. So that's kind of where we are now. Yes, but and the question would be, really, is Iran going to pursue a nuclear weapon? They're close. They could have enough fissile material in a couple of weeks if they chose to do that. The problem, though, is once they've got that, they've got a test article. They don't have a deliverable weapon.
Right.
You got to make it smaller. You got to refine it. Then you got to build a rocket that'll get it to Tel Aviv, as an example, which they don't have. You got to build a reentry system that'll protect your warhead to the heat of reentry at that theater range. You've got to be able to do all those things, and that's going to, while getting a nuclear weapon is very fast, the aeronautical engineering component of it is probably going to take some time, and they would be vulnerable. And once they decide to do that, my theory is the Iranians will not be able to keep it secret. Yeah. I just don't believe they'll be able to keep it secret. We will know. Even if they don't declare it, we're going to know. The Israelis are going to know. And then once you cross that Rubicon, you can't ever come back. You've crossed it. And so they would need to think very long and hard about doing that. Look, that's an argument for me to make. I know Israel views it as an existential threat, so they have to take probably a more conservative position. I would say if Israel wanted to strike, certainly for reasons that you've outlined and we've talked about, now is a good time to do it. Iranian air defenses are down. The targets there, the Israelis have they've certainly developed those targets very thoroughly. They know how to strike them. But it's hard to do away with the program completely. It's
hard
just
to do it completely.
even if we struck it, hard to do away with it. And you don't know what the second order effects would be in terms of sympathy it might gain the Iranians and other quarters of the world, even perhaps other entities providing them with a nuclear weapon. There are a lot of variables that open once you go down that train.
So you've briefed presidents and secretaries of defense. If they looked at you and said, I understand they may not be fully down the path of weaponization, and I acknowledge that there are other hurdles the Iranians need to get through. But General, should we do it now because some of their air defenses are down? Doesn't this put it uniquely on the table in a way it hasn't been in a long time? Would you acknowledge that, yeah, that's a real factor that should or deserves a real policy look?
It does. But my analysis of this actually is in 1987, when things were going really bad for Iran in their war with Iraq, they signed a truce. And then the Ayatollah said, famous line in Iranian statecraft, he said, I'm drinking from a poisoned chalice. And I'm doing it because there's no other way to preserve the state. Iran is in that situation now. I bring this example from 1987 up simply to say that Iran is capable of making rational decisions when the survival of the state is threatened. So I would argue, certainly, we have the capability to take out that nuclear program. I mean, on the other hand, if we can convince the Iranians to completely divest themselves of it, this might be the time to try that. Here's the danger of negotiating with the Iranians. They're not good fighters, but they're great negotiators. They'll bog you down in negotiation while they'll continue to do something else. So I would just say, that's not a military decision. Yes, if asked militarily, this is a good time to strike that program if you choose to do it. It is a generational opportunity to do that. But that's only the military component of the problem. The larger statecraft component of the problem is, where do you want to be 5 years from now in the region? What role do you want Iran to have? If you strike it, Iran's going to respond reflexively, perhaps against Saudi Arabia at great scale, perhaps against UAE at great scale. You might face a theater war. That's possible if you strike the program. Don't know, but it could happen. I would argue, again, it's not a military thing particularly, but I would argue that you could place great pressure on them by threatening that strike directly. And this might be an opportunity to do that, either us or our Israeli partners, and at least try that path. This window is going to remain open for a while, but not forever. They're going to reconstitute their systems. Eventually, the Chinese are going to give them something, or the Russians are eventually going to find a way to get capability in there, and they're going to rebuild it. No strategic advantage lasts forever, but it is a rare, genuine opportunity right now.
Okay, so let's say your answer then was you could degrade the program, not destroy it. And I acknowledge that some of the uranium enrichment is, of course, underground. Can I just ask you, and you may not be able to answer this, but out here in the public domain, I've heard for years that the Israelis need the Moab, the massive ordnance penetrator, sometimes called the mother of all bombs. Does that help? I mean, obviously it helps, but is that a real determining factor in possible Israeli success?
Look, you're right. I can't really talk too much about it. I would simply say the only guys that have that weapon is us, and the only airplane that can haul that weapon is the B-2. No other airplane in the world can haul that weapon. It lets you get after very deep, exquisitely protected targets.
Okay, so you've confirmed something. So you've confirmed then it's not a matter of us transferring something to the Israelis. It literally would require the United States because we have the B-2.
It has to go. There's no other platform that can haul it.
Okay, so there are dozens of nuclear sites inside of Iran. In fact, they seem to have struck one in the exchanges that have occurred so far. Obviously, this makes it exponentially harder because there's so many more targets. But could you maybe assess for us how long or how much could the Israelis acting alone possibly degrade the Iranian nuclear program? In other words, would it be worth it, or do they really, really need the United States to participate as well to make it worth the candle?
I think you need to ask the Israelis that question. I think they can certainly degrade the program. They can significantly degrade the program if they chose to strike it.
Fascinating. Let me ask you one other thing that you're probably not going to be able to answer, but I do hear out here in the private
out here in the public sphere. I have heard scenarios through which the Israelis may send special operators to bolster an attack on Natanz and Fort Al, especially Fort Al. And maybe it's a suicide raid that they're never going to be able to come back from. Obviously, the Israelis have a lot of daring and a lot of panache. But do you have anything to add to that kind of scenario?
I'd leave that one alone.
Okay, understood. Absolutely, absolutely fascinating here. Tell me a little bit more, because I don't know that we've focused very much on the theater war regional contingency. Of course, the Iranians took a shot at Abqaiq when President Trump was in office, and I often read that the Saudis really felt like the United States didn't have their back during that attack. Could you talk a little bit about the Abqaiq attack? Because I think that informs what Trump may or may not be inclined to do if the Iranians took a shot at the UAE or Saudi Arabia again.
Sure. So the Iranian attack in September 2019, very successful attack. They knew where Saudi radars were up. They knew where they were active. They knew where Kuwait radars were up and active. They routed their cruise missiles and drones through areas that made it very hard for them to see it. They were very successful on target. As a result of that, we actually activated our defense plan with Saudi Arabia. We stood up Prince Sultan Air Base. We brought an air expeditionary wing in. We did a lot of things, brought a lot of Patriot batteries in. So we did a number of things to bolster the defenses of Saudi Arabia. We did not consider, and I did not recommend at that time, striking Iran. We did not recommend that. And so all our responses were designed to deter Iran from subsequent attacks. And I think to some degree, no subsequent major attacks like that have occurred. So certainly it was successful. I would also note, though, that the Iranian cycle of aggression continued, culminating in the strike on Soleimani in January of 2020. So they learned, they also continued to escalate throughout the continued fall of 2019 into the early spring of 2020.
Gotcha. All right, let's talk another big issue here today as we begin to wind up the podcast here. Let's talk about Yemen. Let's talk about the Houthi. They supposedly are going to stop some of their attacks because of the ceasefire that's just taken place against Hamas. But I wonder if you might tell us a little bit. I get that it's hard to find where they're located, but I guess I've been a little surprised as many times as we've bombed them, and even the Israelis have bombed them, that we seemingly haven't been able to degrade their capabilities. Why is that? Is that a targeting or intelligence issue on our part, or is it because the Chinese are giving them so much stuff to replace it so quickly? Give us a sense of what's going on there.
I think the principal source of much of their weaponry is Iran. Some of it comes from Russia. Don't know that China has given them very much. I just don't know that. There may be reports out there. I'm not that current on it. But I think the reason that the Houthis have been able to continue is we have not demonstrated the political will necessary to strike them hard enough to make them stop. You can make them stop. There are ways to do that. We have chosen not to do that.
So it's been just a sort of, would you even call it a policy that Biden was doing to try to degrade them, or just symbolic?
I think we were trying to manage it. And, often violent situations aren't susceptible to management.
And can you talk a little bit about, now I've been incredibly impressed with our naval capabilities and our ability to knock down drones and missiles as they've approached. I guess you're probably not surprised by that, but how much does it worry you that they're going to be able to get a shot through and hit some of our naval assets?
So we're on the wrong side of the cost imposition curve. We're employing multi-million-dollar missiles against systems that cost thousands of dollars to launch at us. So you want to be on the other side of that curve. You want to get the missile before it can be launched. Additionally, you don't like to operate the Burke-class destroyers in narrow waters. It's not the best place to operate a ship like that. You're right. Sooner or later, what concerns me is the Houthis are going to get lucky and they're going to hit a ship down there. They've come close a couple times, a U.S. warship down there, and that should concern us all. The battlefield is great at bringing things back to the mean, and no matter how good you are, sooner or later, you face the risk of something getting through. It is very concerning to me, but I think it's not a failure of military capability on our part. It's a failure of political will to actually get after the Houthis. They are deterrable. We can make this stop.
Oh, they are deterrable. Okay. That's interesting.
Well, you can do one of two things. You can impose enough pain so they stop, or you strike them hard enough so they can't do it anymore. You'd prefer to deter them, but if not, you got to go after them pretty hard till there's nothing left that can strike at you.
Okay, last topic, Syria, and just a couple questions here. I mean, first, I want you to put your hat back on and think about how the Russians were able to gain a foothold in Syria. Supposedly that's being somewhat reversed. We'll just have to see if that's absolutely true. But in your estimation, how difficult was that for the United States? Was that a sort of a strategic loss for us for some time? How did you digest it at CENTCOM?
I'm sorry, hit me with that again.
Sorry, the Russian presence in Syria, how much of that was a big issue for
Russia went into Syria. I think it was an act of opportunism. People say, well, the Russians think ahead 7 moves on the chessboard. I don't think so. I think it was opportunism on Vladimir Putin's part. He saw an opportunity to show support for maybe his only external client state, to revive a relationship that had been there a long time, an opportunity to have a warm water port in the Eastern Mediterranean where you could base submarines and other ships. That was very important to him. Maybe at the time they went in, which is right after the war began, he saw it as an opportunity to trade against going into Crimea. Nothing came of that, but you can't rule that out. And finally, it two things. It allowed him to throw sand in our gearbox in the region, and it allowed him to demonstrate Russia's still a factor on the global stage. All of those things are opportunistic things.
Okay, so it's not to be discounted then that Putin had a foothold in Syria. He was able to, as you say, throw sand in our gearbox.
He was, but his capabilities were very limited. We had overwhelming mass against him. We had to apply it that way. He knew it. We knew it. The one time they did something sort of out of the box would have been back in, I forget, 17, 18 maybe, where the Wagner group mercenaries attacked across Deir ez-Zor, and we killed about 400 or 500 of them in one evening. So they remember that. It was a annoyance. It was not core to the region.
Understood. Okay, last question, I promise. ISIS, sure. Terrorism. How do you see this emanating from the Middle East? Should it still be among the top 2 or 3 things that the United States national security community is worried about?
Well, it needs to be one of our top priorities, maybe not top 1 or 2, because I think you got to look at China, you got to look at Russia, you got to look at Iran, North Korea. But I think ISIS has a renewed lease on life, particularly in Afghanistan. We have very limited ability to see into Afghanistan and know and understand what's happening there. So I think that's very important. I think also in Eastern Syria, let's see what happens here if we maintain a forced posture in Syria that sits on top of some of those prisons that have hardened ISIS fighters in them, between 8 and 10,000, of which 1,000 or so we characterize as extremely hardcore. All those things argue for a resurgence of ISIS. So I think we face continued attacks from ISIS. I think that attack in Moscow or south of Moscow just a few months ago is typical of that. And either it's going to be directed or inspired. There have been inspired attacks occur in the United States as well. All of these things sort of go back to ISIS resurging. We just need to be very careful about that. I would argue we probably need to do a little bit more to know and understand what's happening in Afghanistan.
So the so-called over-the-horizon capability that President Biden told us about after the withdrawal of Afghanistan, how big of a problem is it? Can we do it from the Middle East? Is this a big problem for the United States?
Empirically, we know we've done one strike since we left. I would argue there are probably more targets than that, but we have trouble finding the targets. We will have real trouble striking the targets. Very, very, very difficult to do. Understood.
That's an important intelligence question at all. General Frank McKenzie, this has been fascinating.
My pleasure as always to be with you.
That was General Frank McKenzie, Jr. I'm Michael Allen. If you enjoy listening to NatSec Matters, please rate and review the podcast. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, please email our team at bgs@bgsdc.com. You can also find this email in the show notes. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.